Maybe you remember, some of you, the big folderol in about 1988 when the movie The Last Temptation of Christ came out. You remember that? It was a big deal. People boycotted theaters and whatnot. The movie is based on the novel by Nikos Kazantzakis. Someone can say it better than me, maybe? But the author's purpose, he says, is not to be gospel, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but to present the dilemma in Jesus' life between following the human way and following God's way. And so one of the early scenes in the movie you might remember is Jesus. He's a carpenter like his father, and he's carving something out of wood. And then a little bit later we see him bend over
Is that your sound effect?
Yeah, it worked. And pick up this huge piece of wood and begin to carry it to a place where there are many of these huge pieces of wood hung across a tree where people will be crucified. Jesus was a cross builder. And he's tormented by these voices from God saying, this is not what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be doing something else. And Judas, in one of the early scenes, comes to Jesus and says, quit this colluding with the Romans. Quit supporting the oppressive structures and do what God is telling you to do in your mind, what you know is right. Even though it might lead you to hang on a cross yourself. Spoiler alert, in case you haven't seen the movie and you're now intrigued. And I would suggest you watch it again because it really is interesting, but it's 1988. You know, it's a little slow. The special effects aren't all that great. It's interesting. So what happens is, near the end of the movie, this angel comes to Jesus when he's hanging on the cross and says to Jesus, you've done enough. You've done enough. Get down off that cross and go live a life of a normal person. Get married. Have children. Raise them with the values that you've lived. And so we see Jesus with Mary Magdalene and Mary and Martha. He has a whole harem of women and a whole bunch of young ones running around. You need to watch the movie. So, that's the dilemma. Well, really? Really? Is that the dilemma? Live a happy, peaceful life or obey God's will? Can't we do both? I mean, isn't it possible? We come to church on Sunday. We don't murder people. We don't steal. We don't lie except, those little white lies. We don't commit adultery. We don't do those horrific things. We don't chop off the heads of people from religions that we don't approve of. We don't go to war. We're good people. Isn't that enough? What does Jesus really mean when he says, take up your cross and follow me? Do we really have to go to a cross? Let's explore for a minute what Jesus did. But first, let's consider what this does not mean, because this verse has been used to justify all kinds of evils, wickedness. You've heard someone say, you've a chronic illness. Well, that's your cross to bear. You've been the victim of racism. Well, that's your cross to bear. You have a spouse who abuses you. Well, that's your cross to bear. We all have our crosses to bear. You're a person of a same-sex orientation. You have to stay in the closet for fear for your life. Well, that's your cross to bear. You've heard it said, right? That's not what it means. Now, I'm not saying that as a faith community we shouldn't support those people who have chronic illnesses. We shouldn't support people who are victims of spousal abuse or racism. That we shouldn't support people of same-sex orientations. As you know, we do here support those folks. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that's life. That's what happens in life because there's evil in the world. That's not bearing a cross. Bearing a cross is an intentional action. Jesus was so aware of who he was before God and what God had called him uniquely to do that he couldn't not do it. He had to do it. He was so comfortable in his own skin. He was so grounded, so connected to God, so sure that God loved him, that he was willing to do this thing, live this kind of life, even though he knew it was really ticking people off. To the point that the power structures of his own people, who were afraid they were going to lose their protected status in collusion with the Romans, conspired to kill him. His own people, because he challenged them. That's what it means to take up your cross. I'm thinking of the Occupy movement. I'm thinking of people who are willing to stand against the oppressed. The oppressor, sorry. I'm thinking of Rachel Corrie. Remember Rachel Corrie? Gaza, bulldozers plowing down people's homes. And Rachel said, no more of this. And she stood in front of one of the bulldozers. And she died for it. I'm thinking of the folks in Tiananmen Square who lit themselves on fire to object to communist control of free press. It's Labor Day weekend. I'm thinking of labor movements. Haymarket Massacre in Chicago. People were killed for fighting for labor rights. Labor Day, we celebrate because of the labor movement. I'm thinking of people who intentionally took up the cause of fighting for the people who were underserved in labor markets. I'm thinking of the people who just this past summer got the minimum wage of $15 passed in Seattle, and whose movement is walking across our country. Michigan just passed more than $1 increase in the minimum wage. This is to take up your cross. This is to understand that God loves you so much that it doesn't matter if you die for your cause. It doesn't matter if you're humiliated, if you're rejected, if you're shamed. It doesn't matter because God loves you. God is on our side. Now, some people would say, well, That's weak. That's being a doormat, kowtowing. On the other hand, it takes great strength to say, I'm not about the world's success. I'm not about what the world values. I'm about what God values, even if it costs me something. So, 2 stories, because I think that's the only way you can tell this. One story came to me this week as I was thinking about this, and it comes from my very first church while I was in seminary. There was a woman, and I, for the life of me, cannot remember her name, but she was a dental hygienist, and she went through a nasty divorce, and she decided that it was time to make a change in her life. She came in contact with some women who were doing ministry with girls in Honduras. Girls who were being sex trafficked. Back in the day, they didn't call it that. This was 1997 or 6 or 5 or something. But she heard about these girls, and she left her job, and she went to Honduras. Just like that. And she was there for a few years. She sent us letters to the church telling us about her work. The church supported her. But there were some who were really critical. She should not be doing this by herself, on her own. It's not safe, after all. She should be going with a missionary agency who can protect her. And indeed, what happened is this woman got cancer while she was in Honduras, and she had to come back to the States. She spent her last years living with her daughter, and she had no insurance. And the treatment that she needed to deal with the cancer wasn't paid for, so she died of a treatable cancer. Now, I understand that critique, and she was fearless. She said, this is what I have to do. There's no missionary agency that's going to take me, a dental hygienist, without years of seminary and send me to be a missionary. The second story I read this week, and it came to my attention because it mentioned the agency that I used to work for, World Vision. We have quit supporting World Vision because they've decided that it's not in their political best interest to employ and support people with a same-sex orientation. So we're sponsoring children from Compassion instead. Just an aside. There's a couple, Catherine and Mark Wright, I think is their name, R-I-C-H-T. He is the head coach for the University of Georgia football team. Makes about $3 million annually. They owned a $2 million home on a lake. And they read Rich Stern's book. Rich Stearns is the CEO of World Vision. They read his book, A Hole in the Gospel. Rich Stearns makes the case that we have not lived fully into the gospel. There's a hole in our gospel because we've not taken care of the poor and the vulnerable. The Wrights read this book, Hole in the Gospel, with a group from their church, and they sold their $2 million home on the lake, and they gave the money to World Vision. And that's not all they did. The next summer, I think it was last summer, they went to Honduras and dug wells for people who don't have water, clean water. Now, you know the critique. Well, that's not really bearing a cross. Somebody who makes $3 million, that's not really bearing a cross. On the other hand, they could have been at the $2 million home on the lake in the summer. I don't know what it means for you to take up a cross. I don't know what your unique contribution to God's life-giving I don't know. Only you know. And it's based on who you are and what you're good at and what you're passionate about and your unique life situations, how you've been hurt and how you've been healed, who's in your circle of acquaintances that you can serve. I don't know what God is calling you to do. But I know that if you're taking up a cross, it's at great risk that you do it. And that's the clue. That's the clue to knowing whether we're really taking up a cross or not. It's a great risk. And it's the only way to have the kind of abundant life that Jesus promises. It's the only way, is to take up a cross. You can live a life without taking up a cross. You can live a happy, comfortable life that honors God without taking up a cross. But if you want to live an abundant life, that's what you ought to do. Now, what does that mean for us as a faith community? What does that mean for the church? Because you know, the gospel was not written to individual people alone. It was written to communities of people. What does it mean for a community of faith to take up a cross? What does it mean for you to put your well-being at risk in this particular time and place? That's the challenge, isn't it? We're getting ready to host, I'm almost done, I know it's 1. We're getting ready to host what we're calling a World Cafe, where we're going to share our ideas about the abundant life that this church has given you, each of you, if you've been here, the journey that you've been on, how this church has blessed you. It's coming up after worship in a few weeks. And if you're new here, and some of you I don't recognize, I'm new here too. So if you're new, please join us for this, because the conversation will be blessed by people who don't know anything about this community of faith, by people from the outside who can say to us, this church would be a blessing if you did this. So if you're new, don't feel like I'm talking just to people who've been here forever. You're invited. We need to talk about that, because we often can't do this by ourselves. It's too big of a risk. We need one another. We need to practice what we say we're going to do. We need to hear if it's as ludicrous as it sounds, because then it's probably the right thing. We need to be with one another to get that support and encouragement. We need to rally our crosses, so to speak, so that we can do more than what any one individual can do. We can do it all together. I'm curious about what you're thinking. Share it with me during the coffee hour. Jesus said, I came that you might have life